There we go. It's being recorded now, and other information sent, verbalized, or utilized during business-related meetings. By joining a meeting, you automatically consent to such recordings. Any participant who prefers to participate via audio only should disable their video camera so that only their audio will be captured. Video and/or audio recordings of any AIR session shall not be transmitted to an external third party without permission. So just want to make sure we get that out of the way. And as you could see when we first started, we have the raise hand function as well as our chat box, which should be fully functional now. And if you have any issues, feel free to privately message myself or my colleague Mia, and we can help you kind of problem solve. As this is hosted by AIR, we have a few inclusive meeting guidelines. We hope to engage everyone. And if you join us via audio, we can ask you to jump on camera as well. So let that be an acknowledgement there. And try to maximize your microphones when you speak and minimize any kind of background noise and maximize your visual displays as we're doing here. And with that, I would love to hand this off to my colleague, Susan Terry-Holt.
Hi, folks. Thanks so much, Carol. Welcome today. We're really excited to have yet another spotlight series highlighting some of the great work and research that's been done on the impact of the pandemic on K-12 education. And today we are going to hear from our colleagues at HERC and from one of the district partners. And they're going to be talking about both a research practice partnership that's been longstanding and how they do work together, as well as some of the outcomes that they found that student outcomes during the COVID-19 pandemic and in the afterquake period of the pandemic. And then we're going to focus on Q&A discussion and then closing and next steps. I do want to say that this is purposely designed to be a dialogue, and I strongly encourage you to type questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring those questions as we move forward, and stopping the presenters have both agreed that we can interrupt them for clarification points, but we have left plenty of time at the end of their presentation for discussion. So feel free to throw them in there as you think them. We'll keep track of them and make sure there's an opportunity to ask the questions. And if you would like to ask the question in person, we can also, elevate you to be able to kind of have a conversation with our research presenters today. So in terms of this project, we are leading the COVID-19 and Equity in Education initiative. We are hoping to start to build the foundations and organize and coordinate some of those foundations for a field of research that focuses on the K-12 education system, equity, and the impact of the pandemic in that space. In terms of the project itself, the community of researchers for which the Spotlight is part of is a part of what we are trying to do, and we're trying to bring researchers interested in studying and understanding the pandemic K-12 education and the implications for equity and potentially improvement of equity throughout the United States to come together and talk about the types of work that they're doing. And so that's really what we're trying to do moving forward. If you are not a member of the community of researchers, it's free. And basically we provide lots of resources in terms of a literature library that identifies all of the research and journals and reports that we've been scanning since March 2020. So it's a great resource for all of you. We also have a longitudinal database that includes K-12 indicators as well as community-based indicators and health indicators for those of you who are doing research and trying to place it in context. And then finally, we have events like this where we try to create some dialogues, and we'll have other events coming down the line where we have a chance to speak with one another and really understand the work that we've been doing and some of the challenges that we faced during the pandemic, and turn it over to you to identify issues and things that you'd like to make sure we're hearing about moving forward. So right now we have about over 60 folks who have signed up to be part of this community of researchers. And I know that we'll put a link in the chat for those of you who also want to join. But without further ado, I'm very excited to turn over the presentation to Donna and Daniel, who will give us an overview of their RPP focused on informing student outcomes during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you to AIR for this opportunity to share with you all what we have been working on here with the partnership that we have between the Pasadena Independent School District, Pasadena ISD, is the shorthand that we'll see, and us here at HERC. So the title for us today is Research Practice Partnerships that Inform Student Outcomes During COVID, a discussion with the Houston Education Research Consortium. And it's going to focus on sort of this blending of research practice partnerships. What are they, and how have we been doing this partnership that is between Pasadena ISD and HERC, and then how we utilized that partnership during the COVID-19 pandemic. So in terms of a little, introductions, who are we? Hi, I'm Dan Potter. I am Senior Director of Research at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research. HERC is the Education Research Center at the Kinder Institute at Rice University. And my esteemed colleague here presenting is Donna Summers. Donna?
Yes, as he said, my name is Donna Summers. I'm the Executive Director of Research and Evaluation in Pasadena ISD. I am homegrown, which is a pipeline we're very proud of in Pasadena. I went to school here, graduated, started my teaching career here, and about 20 years ago moved to central office. And the role I have now has just been a morph of what it was when I started. But I have spent most of that time, if not all of that time, working with survey feedback information, gap capturing voice, analyzing data, and working on programs.
Excellent. So we're going to start sort of at the end, which is to say, what did we learn through our partnership, as well as what we learned during the pandemic? And I think perhaps it is a Captain Obvious moment, but just to call out that there is no partnership that was planning for the pandemic. Just no one was sitting around here in February 2020 going, hey, let's prepare for this thing. But what our partnership did allow us to do was to pivot. And that's one of those spaces where while we can't necessarily plan for the things, we can build in flexibility. Additionally, one of the things we learned was that the research process sometimes is just more important than the findings, that you do a study, you do an analysis, you field a survey, you might anticipate, oh, we're gonna learn X, Y, and Z and be able to use that to really address something. And in fairness, sometimes you do. And also sometimes just that process of being able to hear from students, to be able to hear from parents, to be able to go through that research exercise carries value independent of whatever it is that you might have been learning from the actual study itself. In terms of what we found from the research that we were doing during the early part of the pandemic, some of the evidence we had come out was suggesting that online learning may not have been all that bad. I don't think that that's necessarily surprising for a lot of folks, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that may have been the case for Pasadena ISD, but also just acknowledging that online learning space, there was a lot of work, a lot of effort going on at that time, and that effort was paying off for definitely for some students there. And finally, one of the big takeaways that we had was this. And sort of leaning into that space of learning was taking place, there was evidence of kind of two learning experiences, two very different learning experiences. Some students doing quite well during the pandemic, continuing to grow, continuing to strive, continuing to make progress. And there was evidence of other students, quite frankly, really struggling during the pandemic. And again, perhaps that's an obvious note, but nonetheless, just trying to draw attention to those two different experiences there. So that's what we learned through this process. And so now let's talk about that process there. So a little bit of background and history on this partnership between Pasadena ISD and HERC. HERC itself was established back in 2011. Originally, it was partnered with one school district in the Houston area. Since then, we've grown that out so that it's partnering now with 11 public school districts in and around the Houston area. Pasadena ISD was one of our early expansion districts, and we began partnering with them formally in the spring of 2018. So of course, now who is Pasadena? And to answer that, let me throw it to our expert.
Thank you. Pasadena ISD is in the southern greater Houston metro area. Prior to COVID, in the fall of 2019, we enrolled almost 53,000 students. 83% of those students were Hispanic, and the next largest subpopulation is African American. We were at the time 79% economically disadvantaged, about 1/3 English learners, 11% special education, and 60% at risk. We also serve 8,000 employees or more. One thing that we did have changed since then, just so you kind of know where we are after that, we are down about 2,000 students from where we were pre-COVID. And we're up about 5% economically disadvantaged. So we're over the 80% mark there. So those are just two of the major changes that happened that we can for sure see in the demographic shift before and after COVID.
Excellent. So that's who we were looking at and who we were working with as part of our research here during COVID. So a little bit of background about what it was like going into the pandemic. So at that time, and next slide would work just fine here. So at that time, as of about March of 2020, there were several, particularly 3 multi-year research projects that we had underway that was part of this partnership between HERC and Pasadena ISD. Those projects were focused on some of the questions and challenges of the entire Houston region, recognizing that some of the educational issues that show up at school districts' doors, they don't really care where you draw your boundaries. They're regional factors, they're society factors. And so we were looking at things like student mobility and continuous enrollment. We were looking at questions and issues around long-term English learners. And in addition, we were also looking at a career and technical education study. There are links in these slides that will contain to some of the output coming out of those studies. Several different reports have been released, several different little research briefs as well. And so there's some information there if you want to learn a little bit more about what we were doing and learning in those studies. Then, of course, in March of 2020, all of a sudden, while those studies previously had been talked about as these are the priorities that we have as a district, very quickly those priorities shifted. Very quickly those priorities changed. And so we were grappling with this question of, in the face of this unprecedented pandemic, in the face of this unprecedented change within our partnership, what is it that our district partners are most interested in needing? What is it that we need to start prioritizing? So again, this is that classic point of, nope, we cannot plan for that pandemic, but we can build in some flexibilities to be able to pivot. We can plan for that pivot. So all right, as of April 2020, all of a sudden, everything we've been doing takes a back seat. What is it that we need to start doing next to support our districts? So next slide, please. Excellent. And so we made some choices at that time. And one of those choices that we made early on was we were going to pause the research that was ongoing. We were in the position to be able to do that, and not every researcher was. There are reasons for that I'm happy to get into if folks are interested in how in the heck did you pause research. But that was the choice we made. Districts needed to be prioritizing this experience of 100% online learning overnight. They don't need to talk to us about student mobility. Priorities, folks. And so, okay, we needed to deprioritize what we were doing. So we started to pause some of that work. Mind you, a little bit of stuff going on in the background, but really stepping forward and going, what is it that we need to do? So while there was no pandemic project at the ready, we did utilize our skills to help start to collect some data from the Houston area in the form of the Gulf Coast Coronavirus COVID-19 Community Impact Survey. This was a very early data collection asking about how lives have been disrupted. There's a dashboard that's attached with it that can help show some of the different ways the Houston area was being impacted. But one of the really important things that continued at this time, even though we had slowed down and again, sort of that pausing of the research and the dissemination of the results, we continue to do regular check-in meetings. A lot of them just, how are folks doing? How can we help? Can we help? What are the supports that might be able to be offered? Through these regular check-in meetings and by making clear we are here, we HERC are at the ready to use our data skills and research skills as best we can, knowing that we're not teachers. We're not perhaps the most urgent need that our district partners were facing. But it was through those conversations of how can we help support that, that some new ideas and projects came to light. And so that's the next slide.
Yeah, so I want to reemphasize how important those regular checks were for our partnership. So Pasadena had not just started, but as you saw, it was about 2018 when we started in. And the first big study, the mobility study, we provided data, but we did not jump in until that project was already on the go. And we were starting with the LTEL study and then continued on with the CTE study. But over the course of the time that most places were closed, Dan and I were still having at least a monthly conversation. And those conversations started with, well, how are those 3 studies doing? I mean, not always. I mean, it was always, hello, how are you? But we would make sure to review those 3 studies. But then always it was, how is Pasadena doing? So we had a conversation once a month about the status of our families, the status of our students, the status of me, the status of Dan, and just comparing what Rice University was going through versus what PK-12 was going through. And it really opened up just a channel of communication that you can't achieve otherwise. And that established the trust and it established the collaboration that when we came to a point where we were just wondering about some things, I had someone I could immediately feel comfortable to ask. And I think without those check-ins, I don't know that we would have achieved the kind of camaraderie and collegiality that we did. So what you see here is some information about 2 different surveys we pushed out in relation to COVID. And I want to talk about the first one just to provide some context. So in April 2020, this was just weeks after Harris County had shut down, March 13th, we went ahead and sent out a parent survey. And that really was a feedback on parent needs. I would call it triage. And that survey was already ready to go because we had just recovered from Hurricane Harvey. So contextually in the Gulf Coast area, we had just been through a major crisis. We had neighborhoods underwater. We had our facilities being used as emergency centers. And we had already developed the communication with our community on what do you need? How can we help you? Just immediate triage. Another thing to know at this time, just prior to COVID, a little context with Pasadena, is that we did have a virtual school for our high schools, a virtual opportunity that pre-existed. And also about 60% of our middle and intermediate campuses, which serve grades 5 through 8, were already one-to-one and were on an online platform out of California, Summit Learning. So we were going into this a little differently than some other folks were because we had already dealt with the emergency. We had already had virtual school. We had already had one-to-one learning. So we had some prerequisites that other districts did not necessarily have in place. So that really helped us to figure out what are the basics needs, what are the learning resources that families need. And that is where I'd really think the piece of equity came in and people rushed to assist. Was that we had kids who were one-to-one, but they were one-to-one on campus where we had stable internet that was built for that. But when they went home, they didn't necessarily have that, or every kid in their home was trying to access videos at the same time for learning, or they had one computer and 5 children. And it was just a bigger issue when you begin to think about that than we had anticipated. So we had several companies that provided us with a MiFi, just a jetpack for families. So their home would have their own internet access. And that really helped in our situations where kids were already one-to-one, had their computers. Where we really felt the pain of not having that in place was elementary and our upper high school. So they were tech savvy, but we didn't have necessarily online learning platforms that we did in other places. So that's kind of where we were walking in to 2019, 2020. And then we returned in 2020, 2021, partial return, not a full return, but back to school. And that was when we decided to roll out the student engagement survey. So this is now we've come back to school. We had about 62% of our students still virtual at the time. We had about 37% of our kids that were face-to-face. Our teachers were teaching both face-to-face and virtual content, which was one of those teacher things you find out real quickly. This is not going to work, and we're going to have to revamp that. But that is when we gave the student survey, was November, December, after we had about 40% of our students back in the buildings. We covered in this specific survey, we really just wanted to know, how are you doing and how is school doing? Because no one had data that you could just go see, what do kids need in a pandemic in education? There was no nothing in the emergency handbook here in Pasadena that said how to handle learning in a pandemic. So when we fielded the survey, we did it in grades 5 through 12, and we ended up with a roughly 12,500 survey responses. So we can go on to the next slide for this one. We covered a series of questions, experiences with in-person and online learning. Now, all the students had experiences with online learning, but at this point, we also had kids back in the building. We talked about teacher-student relationships. We talked about concerns and anxiety about COVID. A lot of our students had older family members in the house that were medically fragile. So there was a lot of concern about, if I get it, then I take it home. Returning to in-person instruction was really a big stress for a lot of families. And then I think what we found most of all, and probably not to anybody's surprise now that we go back and look at it, was this social emotional impact that it had on students, especially those that learned socially, because they went home to very quiet, very solitary environments and didn't have the interaction with friends. They could not dialogue to talk. We do a lot of collaborative learning in Pasadena, and all of a sudden that was very difficult to manage in Zoom rooms, because then you have to have an adult in every room. And it was just kind of a big explosion of things. And when we sent this survey out, really, we were just exploring what students needed. We were getting students' voice in the middle of the craziness. The other thing, we can go on to the next slide on this one. So of the students that responded, this gives you some information about them. About half were online students, 40% were in person, 13% were hybrid. And what that means is, if a student ended up having COVID or someone in the home had COVID, we immediately switch them to online learning, and they may have come back a few weeks later to become in-person learners again. Most of our students were okay with the way we were managing systems and learning. They felt good about the feedback and interaction they were getting with their teachers. They felt like they had everything they needed to complete their homework, and they could focus on learning. So they felt like they had the time and they had the space to learn. And they reported that they were still learning a lot. So even though we had a very awkward educational environment, and it was split in 2 and in 3 in some places, overall, 85% of our students in grades 5 through 12 said that it was working for them and that they were okay with those methods. So we did have a lot of good information in this respect about the schooling in fall of 2020. Of course, we had the expected information. You can see this one on the next slide about the distractions and the stress of the global pandemic. A lot of them, younger kids, you didn't have them watching the news anymore because it was just so pervasive in all the media outlets. And then the other thing the survey did was just give kids a chance to talk to everybody. This is how we feel. Thank you for asking us. I'm the one that distributed the survey link, but I am not their principal. I'm not their teacher. I'm not their counselor. But I still had students reaching out to me and saying, can you help me with my homework? Can you? And I had one that conversed with me for weeks just to say, hi, Miss Donna, how are you? Thanks for the survey. So they were really needing some personal attention, and we're ready to have some discussion. So that's what the survey did for us. Then the next thing we had that was the other big piece of this research was talking about the MAP assessment. So when we think about assessment at that particular moment, we have to add the context in Pasadena again here because it's highly contextualized. With our personalized learning system that we had in grades 5 through 8, that was initiated with a grant, and the grant required that those students take the NWEA MAP growth assessment 3 times a year as part of the evaluation of that program. The program had been growing, has continued to grow, and those particular principals felt like that data would be good data for them to have for all their students. Some of our schools were full online personalized learning. Some of our schools were half and half, bringing on half at a time, piloting before they brought on the whole. But they wanted to go ahead and start giving this assessment. And our elementary principals also felt like they wanted to do it. So we had MAP data for 5 students in 5th through 8th grade from prior to the 2019-2020 school year. In the 2019-2020 school year, that fall, the district administered NWEA MAP growth district-wide, grades 2 through 8, and some high school students in math and reading. Our elementary folks had a little bit of a rough start. It was just hardware issues made that rough for them, but our intermediate and middle had been taking it, so that was completely normal for them. Probably our best administration of MAP to that point was the winter of 2020. We administered that in the January, February window. It went very well. It was solid at all grade levels. And then just a few weeks later in March is when we had the COVID shutdown in Harris County. So there was no testing. There was no state testing. There was no MAP testing or anything in the spring of 20. So we had the fall of 2019 was very good data, short of our elementary, and then the winter of 2020 was very good data for us. So that's just a little background on what we were doing. When we did link the data, because the survey was only administered beginning at the 5th grade, we only linked MAP data beginning with the 5th grade. And we were able to link that with about 6,300 students. One thing MAP does, for those of you who've never used that assessment, it gives you a projected growth based on the norming that they have done. And students who were more engaged in their learning were more engaged and more likely to meet our projections. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to talk a little bit more about the linking and what we found in the results of those 2 types of assessments.
Yeah, so thank you, Donna, for all that fantastic background about where we were coming into with this. So the goal here was to look and see what type of learning was taking place, recognizing we had this gap in the testing taking place in the spring of 2020, but when kids were coming back in the fall of 2020, the immediate question was, oh my goodness, where are they in terms of their learning, whether it be math, whether it be reading. And so we were able to come and Pasadena administered it and was able to get information in both the fall of 2020 and then 3 times throughout that school year, fall 2020, winter 2021, which is January, and then spring 2021 as well. And so we sat down with these data and started linking them with surveys and again, sort of anticipating, oh, we're going to really see, the role that student-teacher relationship plays, or we're going to see the impact that student well-being seems to be a driver. And one of the things that kind of we saw repeatedly was the survey was not necessarily teasing things out for us so well. The survey is giving us good information, but how that information connected with achievement wasn't necessarily clear. A little exception there was when we were then bringing in that question of where were students in terms of their instructional setting. And so as Donna mentioned, within Pasadena, you had students opting into an in-person instructional setting. You had students opting into a virtual setting. And then you had those students in that hybrid space. And let's just leave it at hybrid. It's a lot of reasons why they were there, but so you had a hybrid set. And so we were looking at those 3 different groups of students and asking, how might these have been corresponding to whether or not students were making the projected growth that we were hoping that they would be making? And so one of the first things we saw when we were looking from the fall of 2019 to the fall of 2020 in math was that only about 27% of 5th to 8th graders were meeting or exceeding their projections. This was lower than what you would typically see. And I think this was one of our early indicators. Wow, like that disruption, the spring of 2020 really meant something for students making those gains that we were hoping that they would in math. Okay, having said that, an interesting thing we found in the fall was that those students who were receiving in-person instruction, they were even less likely to meet or exceed as opposed to those students that were receiving online instruction at that time. Looking at reading, very similar story emerges. You have about 42% of 5th through 8th graders who are meeting or exceeding projections between fall of 2019 and fall of 2020, a bit lower than what the district tends to see. That speaking to the disruption that the pandemic had there on students learning in the spring of 2020. Those students who were online, those students who were in person, again, were less likely to be meeting or exceeding their projected levels than those students who were online. There's a lot of reasoning for this, and a large part of it is your classic researcher selection effect, which has to do with who is in person versus who is online. And Don, I don't know if you wanted to say a little bit about some of the policies Pasadena put into place early on in that fall semester of 2020 to try to address questions around student learning.
Yeah, there were definitely two nuances, and they both impacted MAP as well. So one nuance, when you think about the odds of students receiving in-person instruction was half that of online, and that is just backwards from what you would anticipate. But a lot of that we attribute to the fact that our online students had been online students. They had been taking classes online before this started, during the time they were away from class, and some of them had chosen not to come back because it was working so well for them that they didn't have that immediate need for face-to-face assistance. So we had that kind of oddity going on. And then the other thing was our students who were clearly not performing well at home and with the online options, we talked to parents and really worked to get those kids back in the classrooms. So some of these students had just returned to the classrooms, or they had taken MAP right prior to returning to the classrooms. And we knew that they were not performing the way that we had hoped and that they were falling a bit behind. And I wanted to add to that too, some of the reasons we asked her to investigate this was really exploring, had we captured all the trends that we needed to capture, and did we have all the kids back in the building we needed back in the building? Or were there some specific kids that needed more, and what more did they need? So we just want to make sure we were not missing anything. And NWEA at the time had also come out with some of their own research about where students were at this point. So this was sort of relevant to what we were trying to make sure we were doing in Pasadena too. So the self-selection was definitely a difference. And then what happened in Pasadena at this time, which was right around the same time MAP was administered, is that students who had not been doing well at home were encouraged, and most of them came back to the classroom at that time. So by the end of the school year, we were 75% in person and 25% face-to-face. So that's just a little more before we talk about the next slide.
And so speaking perhaps to that return to the classroom of a larger and larger proportion of students, we see both in math and reading throughout that 2020-2021 school year, more and more students are meeting projected growth patterns. And again, that is in both math and in reading. There still continue to be this slightly lingering students in person being a little bit less likely to meet those projections than the online students. And again, that is speaking to Donna's point. For those students who were online for the majority or for the entirety of that 2020-2021 school year, a lot of that was students who were finding success, who were selecting into that space, and who even the district is looking at and going, hey, success, keep it going. Let's make this happen. Whereas for those students coming back into the classroom, that really was an effort on the part of the district. And this was several districts doing this. Isn't this wasn't a Pasadena per se thing so much as how do we help support districts in making that push? Let's get those students back into classrooms in order to be able to help make sure that we're getting them the instruction and supports that they're needing there. And so again, those patterns were observed for both math and reading throughout that year. Next slide. So that was, so that discussion was, and the findings that we were seeing from the survey and the map were giving us some evidence that, again, that online space may not have been all that bad. And for sure, at a minimum, was working well for certain students. A second, if you want to think of it as like major finding or just a second finding that seemed to be quite significant, leads us to our last takeaway, which has to do with this evidence of two very different learning experiences. So as mentioned, the map offers this projected growth. So every student from one year to the next, or from one assessment period to the next, is given a projected gain score. We expect Dan to increase by 8 points, for example. Well, we are able to take that projection and look and see, well, did a kid meet or exceed that projection or not? And when we looked at this breakdown of students who met or exceeded or did not meet, one of the things we saw very quickly is for students who were meeting their projections, they were meeting them and quite frankly exceeding them. Unfortunately, though, the contrast was also there, is that if I wasn't meeting them, I really wasn't. And so again, to use myself, if I was projected to make an 8-point gain and I met that projection, I wasn't making an 8 or an 8.5 gain, I was making a 14-point gain. If I was projected to make an 8-point gain and I didn't quite get there, well, I didn't actually just not quite get there. I was making gains of maybe 1 or 2 points. So these very different learning experiences taking place. We saw that within math and looking at fall to fall within math. If we look at the next slide, we see that that trend continued from the winter to winter. So this is looking at January of 2020, that testing period that wrapped up just in advance of kids going home due to COVID. Looking at that winter 2020 into winter of 2021, again, if I met my projections, wow, I'm really doing something here. But if I didn't, I'm getting tripped up significantly there. And then additionally, even within the academic year 2020 to 2021, and this is the next one, once more we saw this trend within the math space. If I was meeting or exceeding projections, I'm really meeting or exceeding projections. And if I wasn't, I was having a very different learning experience during that time period. There's a similar trend, admittedly a little bit less pronounced within the reading space. But again, this was sort of our second one, this two very different learning experiences.
And that is a great segue into the next piece because it speaks to reading specifically. So the question is, where are we now? And we have two things going on. We do have a next step research project going on with HERC to see where are we now? Are we catching up with where we would expect based on 2020 norms that NWEA established? Or are we still behind them in some areas? But what you see here is actually our state assessment. So the history of state assessment in relation to COVID, it was administered, of course, the spring of 2019. Following shutdown in March of 2020, there was no state assessment administered. So what you're seeing, the blue bar is 2019. It was the last administration of our state reading assessment prior to COVID shutdown. There was no bar. There's no bar there for 2020 because we did not administer any assessments. In the 2020-21 school year, that spring, this was the first state assessment after shutdown, where we did not have all the kids back in the building. We had some. Most of our students took STAR and most of them took it online because that is coming in Texas and all online administration. So this felt like a good opportunity while we're already doing things online to go ahead and manage it that way. So the red bars are the first pre-COVID assessment in 2021. But our big celebration is that all that focus on where are they, what do they need, how do they need it, we have really seen in reading specifically the green bars, which is this past school year, the first full school year back in buildings for all of our students. And you'll notice here that not only did we return to our pre-COVID shutdown performance, but we have exceeded that in reading in all but our introduction ELA course in high school, which is significantly different than our 3 through 8 exams. it has a writing component that the others do not. So we have been very excited to see this data. It is in contrast, however, to the next slide, which is our math data. Again, we have far exceeded where we were that year of some kids in, some kids out, but we have not quite caught up to where we were in the pre-COVID stages. And we have several thoughts on that, but I think the one that makes the most sense is what students were doing at home or what we were focusing on during this time of great stress. We were really, everybody was giving grace. There was not as much homework. There was not as much, well, stress is just the better word. So everybody was getting grace everywhere. And over the time period that kids were at home, if you think about reading learning and you think about math learning, those are two very different types of learning. And we have spent years with a high ELL population, our English learner population. So we are well versed in how you acquire language and literacy. And those come with listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And when we had students at home and even the online interactions, we were still listening to each other talk. We were still listening to conversations. We were still speaking to each other more than ever. We were speaking to each other because they were face to face, and that was how they communicated. We had a lot of kids still reading because some of those reading contests were still going on. Online books were available. Everybody, all the wonderful organizations that just opened up the floodgates of online resources. All of that was still there. They were not writing necessarily, which I think is evidenced here in English 1. But students were still doing things to build literacy skills at home, maybe not intentionally, but they were doing them. Even as far as reading closed caption on YouTube, we had all kinds of things going on. But what we did not necessarily see is that students were not just talking about multiplication facts. They weren't just talking about polynomials. You just don't have that, doesn't pop up in everyday conversation, as it turns out. It does for us and it does in my house, but that's apparently abnormal. So we really were not surprised to see this difference in math. And actually, if you're reading national research, which I'm sure you are, then you will know that most everybody is seeing this post-COVID effect on math. That we are making gains. We just did not catch up as fast as we did when we were looking at reading and literacy. And again, as I mentioned, the next steps for us is continuing with the progress monitoring we do in MAP, but then also sending that data back to HERC for another, where are we now dip? Are we catching up with where we're seeing other people across the nation when NWEA is putting out their information? So before we wrap it up and open for questions, I just wanted to kind of reiterate the Pasadena ISD side of what we learned. And this one is the first bullet: no partnership plans for a pandemic. Obviously, we had no plans for how we would work together in that environment any more than teachers and students did. I think the fact that we kept the communication is what made it work. That we did have those regular meetings and we still continue to. I visit with HERC monthly and we talk about not only what's going on between our organizations, but what's going on internally within our own organizations, kind of comparing notes and seeing where there might be some opportunities to share and do things that aren't on any of our agendas. Research process can sometimes be more important than findings. And I think this was definitely, we are prepped now. When I talked about we're going to work with HERC on another project, that is a direct influence by what happened in the COVID research. It was just popcorn research. We just needed to know this and we need to know this now. And I think HERC has developed a how do we manage popcorn research in an easier way in our organization. And I think that was very helpful to Pasadena. And then the evidence of the two very different learning experiences. One of the things we've done as a district is expanded our online learning platform. So that was definitely a crucial piece for kids not being in the classroom, but we're seeing that kind of growth even now that we're back to full-time buildings. Those students are still seeing progress like that in reading. So we've extended that down to the 4th grade. We have a lot of our campuses engaged in online learning in the 4th grade. And we go on up through high school, smaller groups in high school, because you've got a lot of competing factors in high school, like extracurricular and advanced placement. But we are expanding that in hopes that that will continue to give our students the kind of individual successes that they need. So I think that's the Pasadena side of what we've learned.
And I think that's a wrap.
All right.
Thank you, and questions and contact info there too.
Thank you so much, Donna and Daniel, for sharing this process. It is really fascinating. And there's a lot of surprises, I think, which, you don't usually feel that surprise. I'm curious, when you saw how the students who were in online learning were performing, were you shocked?
Those numbers were run several times.
I will say Herc was shocked. They definitely made some phone calls. They said, this is what we are seeing in the data. Can you explain this? And that's when it really clicked how long those students had been in online learning already. And that this particular group of students, the 5 through 8 that we were surveying, that particular group of students had the experience.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a surprise.
And your instructors are trained to, teach in an online setting too. So that seems like a real, you didn't know that would be your advantage in a pandemic, but a real advantage.
Well, and even the MAP assessment that we gave to elementary, that was the first time our elementary campuses had done anything fully online like that for everybody in grades 2 through 4. And that happened twice just in the months prior to COVID. So the timing was amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And then in terms of how you're sharing this data in the district, how are you sharing it with the educators? Like, what is I'm curious about their response and how it motivates them or doesn't.
I'm going to speak to all the research, and then Dan, if I forget something, just remind me a little bit. So we have taken pieces of each project actually and shared them in various different ways. So one of them, the mobility study, the very first one that we did, I think that is going to turn out to be something really amazing that we are right in the middle of. So with the mobility study, we came into that one after the fact. We got there just in time to drop our data in the data zone. And we began to get results back. And one of the results was about students leaving our district and why they're leaving our district. Well, the question came up, why are they leaving? But one of the things that HERC discovered in their mobility study was that in the Houston area, more students are dropping out between 5th and 6th grade than they are between 8th and 9th grade, which was completely an unexpected finding. And then we started to think why. And we had several reasons we thought, and they investigated all the numeric ones for us. And then it became very clear that quantitative research alone was not going to solve that question. So their wonderings were going on, and we wanted to pursue that particular question. So they ended up with a researcher. Dan, do you want to talk about how that happened, how you found Julia?
Sure. Yeah. So, one of the benefits of having HERC located at Rice University is you've got wonderful, motivated grad students right around. And one of the grad students in the sociology department was very interested in the school choice question. Where are parents choosing for their children to go? And had done her master's thesis looking at that question within the charter school space. And so when this finding came out, and Donna, I apologize if I missed this, I think just to make a fine point to the 5 to 6 transition question, while for many, many districts that 5 to 6 is the elementary to middle school, of course, that's when kids are leaving. That is not the case for Pasadena. Pasadena does a K to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 model of elementary, middle, intermediate, and high. And so this pattern that Pasadena was seeing is actually occurring between what would otherwise be a contiguous grade transition. And so Julia heard about this findings, came to me and goes, Dana, I'd like to explore that further if you don't mind. And what's wonderful about the partnership space was that then gave us the opportunity, and to Donna's point, we had already been kind of talking through this. So what is going on here? Knowing that that conversation was happening and Julia coming forward, it was just a matter of bringing entities together and saying, hey, let's figure that out. And so, yeah.
And on the presentation side, so the initial findings I shared immediately with our cabinet. We have about half of our cabinet's instructional and the other half is the business administration. And their immediate question was figure out why. And we looked at things like state assessments and, we weren't like, we were the anomaly because we didn't have a transitional break there. So it was a great place to think it's got to be something else. And we can control for that in Pasadena because we're not breaking buildings here. So then we shared it with our middle school principals and they brainstormed, why could this be? And Herc took all those brainstorms and researched them. And then we presented this study and talked with our middle school principals and had 4 volunteer to have a qualitative study dissertation project take place on their campuses. So we're in that right now. So that is just, yeah, it's wonderful. That's just one example of how we use the data, but we almost without fail, it gets presented to cabinet so that they can use it as their planning resources. And then we also share it with principals as they're building capacity and working in their buildings on continuous improvement.
So there's a question or two in the chat that I want to make sure we get to. One question is, what do you think explains the 2 groups in terms of meeting projections, some learning a lot, some learning a little, but apparently few in between? Do you have thoughts about that?
Dan, you want to take that one? Or do you want me to?
I mean, I can talk about it in terms of like what we tried with the data to understand what we were seeing. And then Donna, if you want to help bring me back to reality. So from a data perspective, our first question was, oh, well, these are clearly our first thought was these are clearly 2 different groups of students. One of them is going to be eco-dis, the other one's not going to be economically disadvantaged, the other one's not going to be. One of them's going to be English learner, emergent bilingual, the other one's not going to be. And the other, again, one of them is going to be projected to have made 2-point gains and the other one's 14-point gains. And so, control after control, bringing in the surveys, adding in the well-being metrics, teacher relation, like I just pulled all of these different features in and I guess in fairness, we explain some of that difference, but we do not get rid of that. If I was meeting projections, wow, was I meeting projections, and vice versa. So analytically, it's a massive question mark that exists, which, I mean, sending it even to Donna was like, Donna, this is the pattern, I promise. And I cannot for the life of me explain what's going on. Data wise. So Don, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I really think this goes back to the student learning discipline and their ability to learn at home. So some students do very well with individualized learning. And I'm not talking about the platform right now. I'm just talking about I, as a solo student, can learn on my own. You give me instructions, I'm going to be fine with that. Whereas other students really need the social talk of things and the ongoing collaboration to be able to learn. So qualitatively, I had that going on in my own home. I had a senior in high school and a 3rd grader, and they were 2 different abilities of learning with this online system. And one blew it out of the water, and the other one, she maintained, but she did not blow it out of the water. And she's my social learner. She needed to talk about the reading. She needed to talk through the math problem. She needed to see the teacher. I do, we do, you do. She needed all of that. So I think that really probably is what come down to the difference. I mean, Dan, they tweaked it, manipulated it every way they could to come up with an easy quantitative answer, but I don't think it's an easy quantitative answer. I think that really is about students and their home environment and who and what they had there to learn to help them.
That's interesting. Mike, we have time for one quick question.
Well, it was
Did you
just a
wanna-
follow-up. I wonder, you have map data the year prior to the pandemic? I'm wondering if you'd need, I don't know whether you have a year for which this could be done to see if, without the pandemic, if that would still be true, if some kids met their projections and those met them by a lot, and then some didn't, and they
Oh,
didn't
yeah.
meet it by a lot. But anyway, this is a topic for another day. Thank you. Very, very, very interesting question.
I can address that little one just real fast because honestly, I don't know the amount of time that our students spend on the Summit platform. It's constant and ongoing. So I don't know that there's a way to time it. It's not like they're on and then they're off. All of their assignments are in the platform. It is a full online learning platform. All their resources are in the platform. They do have workshop days with their teachers, but all the resources are in the platform, even on workshop days. So other than small group instruction to follow up, they are in some way, shape, or form in those systems.
Thank
They
you.
were pre-pandemic.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. This has been really fascinating.
Yeah, this
Thank
is a
you.
wonderful study. We would love to hear about any follow-up that you have and share it with folks in the community and broader if we can. This is really, really exciting to hear about. And it's great to hear about the connection between the district and the university and how that partnership is evolving. And I like that you have just-in-time dissertation research that can be thrown in. That's very appealing. At any rate, I just want to say thank you so much for the presentation. We truly have enjoyed it, and I hope you do keep in touch with us and the community of researchers to let us know how things are going and any follow-up explorations. For folks who have joined us, there is a closing survey that you'll see at the end of this presentation, and we do hope you complete it. We're trying to continue this series and make it meaningful for you, and so any feedback you have is more than welcome. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was nice to share.
It was wonderful to meet you, and thank you so much.
Thank you.